we are living through like what I think is a very similar moment to the 1980s in terms of the attacks that we're seeing on trans and queer kids.
It was during year one of COVID that I purchased my own Pee-wee doll and really started to become quite nostalgic for my childhood.
Hi, John.
Hey, Cait, how's it going?
I'm doing well. Thank you for doing this.
Of course.
Looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Let's start by introducing ourselves. So, my name is Cait McKinney. I wrote the book I Know You Are, But What Am I on Pee-wee Herman. I think by the time this podcast comes out, I'll be an associate professor.
Ooh, congratulations.
Thank you. In the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. And I work on queer media history, which is kind of how I met you, John.
Yeah, absolutely. I am John Stadler. I am an assistant professor of film studies at North Carolina State University, and my research is centered on queer media with a strong focus on pornography, although I'm moving into other realms as well. I'm so excited to be diving into the Pee-wee Herman universe with you today. So yeah, thank you for including me. I know we've often seen each other at conferences, so it's really lovely to get a chance to kind of talk about your work.
Yeah, when Maggie Stadler at University of Minnesota Press asked who I would want to do this with, you were the first person who came to mind for a couple of reasons. Like, first, I've always admired your work and your work in the field of queer porn studies. And this book is not a porn studies book per se, but there's a whole chapter about Paul Rubens' arrest for indecent exposure in a adult cinema, and that's part of what we'll talk about today. And also, when I was presenting on this work at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference, you came to the paper, and I kind of realized in talking to you after that you were a big Pee-wee fan. So it felt like a good match.
Yeah, I was obsessed with the show as a kid. So my siblings, my brothers in particular, Saturday morning, we would all race downstairs to watch the cartoons, and my brothers always were watching, like X-Men and Transformers and all these other shows that I sort of was just this begrudging viewer of. It was like my brothers got to pick that, but whenever Pee-wee Herman came on, that was my show, and they often didn't sit to watch it. So my brothers would leave, and I got to watch Pee-wee Herman by myself. And it's only much later, coming out in my 20s, that I realized what a sort of formative role this show played in my sort of very early proto-queer childhood, right?
Yeah. So Pee-wee was your like early gay Saturday morning screen time.
It really was. I can't even think of another show that comes close to being as formative for me, right? And as just like it was my safe space to watch this show. Just watching some man boy misbehave and be wacky and have fun felt so comforting to me.
Yeah, it was the same for me, and I think so much of what the show did as a like queer text was make this kind of world
Yeah.
that we could be in. The whole show takes place in the space of Pee-wee's playhouse. So it's like very contained. And the playhouse is this like live action set full of humans and also puppets that's like just absolutely wildly styled and quite spectacular and very expensive to produce in a way that you don't see on children's television anymore, right? Like shows today, like Paw Patrol, for example, they're like deliberately extremely inexpensive to produce, but this was like a high budget kind of world that we could just like spend 30 minutes in every week, and there was something really special about that, I think.
Yeah, it was delightful, a delightful sort of escapist world to explore different possibilities in.
I thought, John, I could kick us off by reading the first page and a half of the book.
I would love that.
Though I ought to be done with the television show I loved in the first grade, I can't seem to let go of Pee-wee's Playhouse. The show was a portal for a lot of queer kids of my generation who grew up in the 1980s. We could spend Saturday mornings with a hyperactive weirdo in a tight-fitting suit who looked and acted a bit gay, transgressed gender norms, but had found friends, safety, and a home of his own to play in like no one mean was watching. Week after week, Pee-wee Herman, played by Paul Rubens, arrived in the playhouse, said good morning to his toys and technologies, and played along with viewers at home, children and adults alike. From 1986 to 1990, the 30-minute live-action program became one of the most popular children's television programs in history, winning 15 Emmy Awards and inspiring films, merchandise, and a new schoolyard comeback for any insult. Pee-wee's catchphrase, "I know you are, but what am I?" said in a silly nasal voice, was used to shut down bullies everywhere. The show landed within an unfolding AIDS crisis that was reshaping sexual politics in the United States and Canada, including through violent homophobic backlash. Against this cultural backdrop, Pee-wee was wacky, wild, and unapologetically himself. And he gave audiences permission to be that way too. And this mattered in the late 1980s when queer people's intimacies and very ways of being and emoting in public were under attack. Pee-wee's Playhouse ended in flames alongside the first public sex scandal I can remember. Just before the show was to start syndication, Paul Reubens was arrested in a suburban porn theater for exposure of sexual organs, a phrase that Pee-wee's Playhouse could have turned into a whole bit about a horny piano if the show wasn't for kids and hadn't already wrapped months before the arrest. This kind of porn theater sting operation was common in 1991, a calculated, stigmatizing response to HIV/AIDS aimed at rooting out public sex cultures through raids on bathhouses, theaters, and bars with back rooms, often under the guise of what we call public health. From the state's perspective, the practice had the added bonus of raising real estate values through gentrification, as unseemly businesses closed under pressure from police harassment of patrons and owners. News media fashioned Reubens, the children's entertainer, as a risk-taking pervert. He became the butt of late-night TV jokes, and his career suffered in the months and years that followed. Queer people, kids and adults alike, stuck with Pee-wee through it all. Kids stayed fans despite parents who threw out their Pee-wee dolls and bootlegged VHS tapes, while adults defended Reubens against the false associations with pedophilia that attached to the story. The show's ongoing cult status decades later speaks to the main contention of this book. We aren't done with Pee-wee's Playhouse because there's much to learn from sticking with it. I look back at Pee-wee as an expansive, mediated scene that moves from television screens to the domestic technologies inside the playhouse to the porn theater as an otherwise space under attack. Thinking across these scenes in the ways we remember and misremember Pee-wee offers lines of flight for queer understandings of media. Ways of moving between the real and the fictive, complicating ideas about adults, children, and technology, and knowing history through speculation and against causality.
Thank you so much for reading that for us, Cait. It's such a beautiful and compelling introduction to your book. I love the way, especially, I think it's so important that you contextualize this moment, because for people who didn't grow up at this period, if you were a young queer person, the way in which you understand queerness or homosexuality or any kind of sexual or gender deviance is through the AIDS epidemic, right? Like my first association with queerness was with death, and I felt it especially pronounced. I grew up in Indiana, where at the same time that Pee-wee Herman was coming out, Ryan White was dying of AIDS, and so we saw it on our news all the time that the local child dying of AIDS. I believe it was through a blood transfusion. But it all got sort of wrapped up in this pathologizing of queerness as illness, queerness as disease. So reminding us that Pee-wee occupied a space that was informed by this is, I think, so important. I just wanted to, in addition to discussing how lovely it is that you've historicized this, I wondered if I could just ask you what brought you to this project, because it's so timely, of course, and tragically because Paul Reubens died last year. But I don't imagine you were writing this with any sense of knowledge that would happen. And so I would just love to know a little bit about what brought you back to Pee-wee, in I don't know when you started this, 2022, 2023, whenever you were writing it.
Yeah, I mean, I finished the book about a month before he died, and I'm sure his friends and family knew that he was ill, but fans didn't, right? So it was a surprise to me, and I ended up having to revise the book. So I went from kind of this author like nervous that the person who their book was about would like read it and hate it, hopefully love it, to somebody who was, as a fan, kind of like mourning this person's passing, along with like all kinds of other queer fans who were really like devastated by Ruben's death in the summer of 2023. And I think a lot of us went back to sort of revisit the show and what it had meant to us in that moment. I have always wanted to write something about Pee-wee's Playhouse. I think it was the like freedom and space opened up by going up for tenure and feeling like I had the room to write about an object that maybe some people wouldn't take as seriously in the field of academia. And I also like wanted to work on writing scholarly work that was more true to me and who I am, and where my voice and my presence was more there in the writing. And it felt like a perfect sort of object to do that with, because my relationship to it is like so personal because of what it meant to me as a kid. So I decided I wanted to write about the show, and initially I wanted to write about the playhouse itself as this magical interior space that is radically separated from the world out there. So Pee-wee in the show almost never leaves the playhouse. There's no regular exterior set. You are contained within the space. And I was thinking about that like in the sort of deep depths of COVID lockdown,
Yeah.
and what it means to be inside, right? And that's
Oh
how the work
gosh.
started.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was thinking too about how the pandemic informed my own relation to Pee-wee. I know we'll talk about this later, but it was during, I think, year one of COVID that I purchased my own, and I'll show this, although the podcasters can't see it, my own Pee-wee doll, and really started to become quite nostalgic for my childhood. And there were a number of reasons why that is. My dad got sick and I helped my parents move out of our childhood home. So I was quite literally going through my bedroom at the time and clearing out things that I probably should have cleared out years ago. But yeah, it I feel like COVID produced the possibility for a kind of deep contemplativeness that I hadn't really given myself space for before, right? There was just nothing to do, right? So I was really kind of reworking my thoughts on childhood and such. So it's really interesting to see these parallels, especially with spatiality and the show's own inward and sort of enclosed quality, especially when you think about it against the films, which are so much about going out into the world for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, right? They do often have moments of like interiority, but it's usually about Pee-wee exiting a house or exiting a space.
Against his will too. Like
Yeah,
he doesn't want to leave. He gets forced out into the world in those films reluctantly.
right, which I find so interesting. I'm just really curious. I wish Rubens were still here for us to ask him or to contemplate why this very stark division between space from the TV show to the films.
I mean, I
I,
imagine some of that distinction is about budget, right? Like you have a huge budget to
yeah.
make a film, and you have a smaller budget to make episodic children's television. Although Pee-wee's budget was huge, like CBS was spending like $300,000 an episode on that show in the later seasons, which
Oh
was
wow.
absolutely unheard of at that time, right?
Yeah,
So I
that's
think part
huge.
of it's budget, but I think it's also like it's the character. He is a creature of habit, of routine, and of his space. And so a really compelling plot point for the films is to use that budget and that, hour and a half to see what happens when you take Pee-wee out of this world in which he makes sense into this like outer world in which he doesn't make sense, and sort of mayhem ensues. And I think we learn a lot as characters who have no um, schematic for understanding Pee-wee come into encounter with him.
Was that a conscious decision in the book to focus primarily on the show?
Yeah, it was absolutely a conscious decision, because I wanted to, like, what for me is really interesting about the show is it had this, first of all, it was on network television, so it had really wide viewership. It was on CBS. And second, it had like no other children's television programs, a real mixed audience of adults and children. So about a third of regular viewers on Saturday mornings were adults. And I was really interested in it as this like episodic network shared text and what it meant for both adults, most of whom were queer or queer adjacent in some way, to share this text with like just regular 6, 7, 8, 9 year olds of all life experiences. I wanted to like be with that experience of the show for sure. And I think also like that's primarily how Pee-wee is known. Like the films were a bit more culty. People who are Pee-wee fans are very familiar with the films and love them, and I love them. But I think it's the show that really had this wider appeal, and it was what people went to after the porn theater sex scandal. The show was like the target for people's anger and homophobia in the aftermath of that.
I was wondering if I could follow up with another thing that you said in this introduction, which is Pee-wee offers lines of flight for queer understandings of media, ways of moving between the real and the fictive, complicating ideas about adults, children, and technology, and knowing history through speculation and against causality. I'm really latching on to the notion of speculation and against causality, and another word that you used earlier about misremembering.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that I love about the book, and that I hope you can speak a little more about, is the way that you turn to friends, family, colleagues, and just do this really lovely, almost like a kind of oral history of people's memories of the show, but also of their misremembering. And I'm wondering what you think the value or the place of misremembering is for fans of the show, because I think you're aware I have my own misrememberings of this show that I told you about briefly, which include like misremembering the ending of the show where Pee-wee jets off on his scooter out of the house, or out of the playhouse rather, and I had misremembered that as him riding his bicycle through the sky and flying. And so, I don't know what that says about me or about my relationship to the show, but I am really struck by the methodology that you deploy in the book. I feel it's so innovative, and I wonder too, just because it's this cute, adorable little book that has little chapters. It's not the typical monograph style. I'm just wondering. I guess it's a two-part question. I'm wondering about misremembering, and the place of that, but also just about the format of these books within academia. Hopefully, that's not too boring of a question.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a great question, John. I think first with the question about misremembering, a lot of the approach I take in the book, like at some point in the book, I call it like bad research methods and like
Yeah,
leaning into like bad in scare quotes research methods that
right.
I would never be allowed to teach like graduate students in my program, for example.
Yeah,
But like as I was working on the book and people would ask me what I'm working on and I would tell them, so many like queer folks who are friends of mine would respond with this reaction of like interest, but also something like grief or sadness, which was interesting to me because it's like such a joyful and funny show. And I kind of realized the profoundness of what was taken away from people of our generation. I'm born in 1983. John's born around the same time. So we're both sort of in our very early 40s right now.
very early.
We just turned,
Just turned 40
we're
days
basically
ago,
both 39, if we're
basically.
being honest. But like what was taken away, right? And so I started asking people like, well, what do you remember about that time when Rubens was arrested? And for lots of reasons, the primary one being like homophobia, for most of us, like no one was talking to us about what happened to Rubens, which is like he was arrested for doing like a really normal, banal thing that lots of men do. He was in a porn theater, which exists for people to watch porn in. And if they want to masturbate in, it's not harming anyone. There's a
Right.
social contract in that space. And that's something that as queer adults, we all understand now, right? But at the time, no one explained that to us. And it was part of this moment of homo and AIDS phobia, of just like shaming and erasing Paul Rubens from existence. And so I became really interested in what people understood when they were kids at the time that it happened and when they realized that that information was wrong, which for me was at some point in my 20s. I was like, oh, that was really messed up and homophobic. right? What happened to this television character that I love? But I think like my interest in the misremembering is I think that there's a lot of learning to be had in leaning into that misremembering because it tells us something about the function of homophobia around cultural texts and how cultural suppression works. And we need to think about that right now because we are living through like what I think is a very similar moment to the 1980s in terms of the attacks that we're seeing on trans and queer kids and the ways that those attacks like are strategically trying to cut them off from relationships with queer and transcultural texts or trans and queer adults. So that was my interest in the misremembering is like, and I think that we have to understand the show Pee-wee's Playhouse only through its entanglement with what happened to Rubens. Like we can't know the show otherwise. It was just so significant. And then, I mean, the format of these Forerunners books that Minnesota does, which are acquired by Leah Pennywork, who's an incredible editor, they're like 25,000 ish words. So they're quite short. They're like really long essays, more than books. So they are like bound like a book. So I can be like, it's a book, y'all.
It is a
But
book.
it is a book, but it's like it's kind of perfect for this format because it's like long enough to be serious, but it's accessible. You can read it in a few sittings, and I wanted to give people a kind of like accessible experience of diving into this story of what happened and some ways of revisiting and rethinking about the Playhouse as a space.
Yeah, accessibility here, I think, is so key to the book and to the series. It really is something you can sit down and read in a couple sittings, and it's quite just enjoyable, right? It doesn't read with the same. I don't want to be too despairing of academia, but it doesn't feel so stuffy, right? It feels a lot more inviting. The other thing that you said that I really appreciated about this book was the salience that it brings to our current moment, regrettably, indeed. And we don't have to belabor the point, but the way in which the trans community right now is experiencing such strong phobia, transphobia, and its own kind of sex panic, we even see this happening at the Olympics quite literally right now, is quite stark. One of the things I really appreciate about the book is that it lends insight and a window onto an earlier sex panic. And it's so fascinating too, the way that Pee-wee is queered, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear queer, immediately assume a kind of sexual queerness. And certainly there is, to a degree, that at play in the various shows and films. But I think what the book really illustrates for me is just how queer the gender is of Pee-wee Herman and just how non-normative and against the grain he was, and that's, I think, on some level what I found so compelling as a kid, if I had to put words to it, was this is basically a sissy. This is like a fey boy who is not subscribing to the normative standard of what it means to be masculine or to be male, and he is allowed to be that way. No one is stopping him, policing him, telling him he has to be a different way. And there are other kinds of challenges, like, and we can talk about this if we have time, the way that Pee-wee is constantly being paired with girls and women who have attraction to him that he, one way or another, gets out of that scenario where he's sort of paired up to have the kind of heteronormative pairing. And in one way or another, he usually evades it. But for me, what was so striking about the book was really thinking about gender and the way that gender is being thwarted or played with.
Yeah. I mean, you have raised the important point that sex panics are cyclical. They're not a thing from the history that we have moved past. They come and go. And the reason that they come and go is because they're doing cultural work in relation to a particular political movement and how it desires for the world to change. So we're seeing sex panics right now in relationship to right-wing movements, kind of anti-internationalism, anti-immigration, white supremacy, and the entanglement of all of these things, right? Like trans folks are a convenient object in order to justify the move towards like fascism and normalization. But at the time of Pee-wee, what the show was responding to with this sissy character was Reaganism and this like autonomous, rugged vision of white masculinity that was similarly tied to like white flight, the destruction and abandonment of cities and the Black and brown folks who call them home. And so there's like something similar going on here, right? With like this policing of gender as a way of like producing a kind of violent and fascist world. And yeah, he was like the perfect sissy. Like, what a lovable sissy he was. I like to think that there's more room in the world for people who are understood to be boys or think of themselves as boys as to be sissies now, but I don't know that that's actually true. I think we're in another moment of a real kind of narrowing of what it means to do gender. That is sort of another sad thing that this book brought me to is drawing those connections between the 1980s and the present.
Yeah, well, and you've, named it yet again. I know I talked to you about this earlier, but I was feeling such a strong sense of both nostalgia, but also melancholy when I was preparing for this. And it was bound up with joy too. It was, remembering the joy that this character used to bring to me, but also feeling this real loss about the way that the show was sort of evaporated from my consciousness, never to be found again. And then going back to it in my late teens and early 20s, not necessarily to the show, but just going back to the scandal, right, that precipitated the end of the syndication of it. So yeah, it's a real mixed emotional quality or feeling to return to this. I want to, maybe, if it's okay with you, touch on just the 3 chapters that you have here, where you talk about the playhouse, the porn house, and the doll. If you are up for it, I was wondering if, just to get the ball rolling, we could think about what some of your favorite scenes are from the actual TV show and the playhouse. One of the lovely things about the first chapter is the proliferation of objects, most of which are animate, that occupy the space of the playhouse. And I love the way that you bring them into conversation to what we today would think of as the smart house, since so many of these objects can speak and seemingly think and engage with Pee-wee. Do any scenes or objects within the playhouse really jump out to you or still speak to you today, and why?
Yeah, I'm really drawn into any scene in the show that involves these 4 characters who I write about at length in the first chapter of the book as the sort of computational characters in the playhouse. So Pee-wee lived in a world called Puppet Land, and his sort of friends in the playhouse are a mix of human characters and actors who visit the playhouse, and then the puppets who live inside of it. And there's many of these puppets, but the 4 who I'm especially interested in were kind of like I think of them as proto smart home technologies, or like networked objects. So the first one is Conky 2000, who's like this kind of DIY robot looking character. At the beginning of every episode of the show, Conky gets unplugged. He's been charging overnight. He boots up and he has this dialogue with Pee-wee where he spits out what's called the word of the day on a piece of like receipt paper. Pee-wee reads the word of the day. It's always like a commonly used word that you're going to inevitably say in a sentence a few times throughout the rest of the episode. Anytime the word is said by anyone in the playhouse, everybody else has to scream really loud, and the viewers at home are supposed to scream as well. So Conky is this sort of interactive robot whose work in producing the secret word produces these like interruptions of chaos throughout each episode of the show.
I almost feel like we should have one. I mean, can we possibly have a podcast about Pee-wee Herman and not have a word of the day?
It's just a bummer when only 2 people are screaming.
It's true. Yeah, it would probably be a little obnoxious for the listeners.
Yeah. I did
Sorry.
do a secret word at the like in-person book launch I had, which
Did
there was
you?
a lot of people at that. Yeah, the secret word was gay. Ah!
uh, I love it.
And that was fun because you had this like chorus of, 75 people or whatever screaming
Just
every time,
shrieking. Yeah.
shrieking. Yeah.
That's lovely.
But yeah, I mean, Conky, I love like the sort of mutual chaos that he produces. And there's 3 other technologies that are similarly like early network computers that I write about. So they're Magic Screen, which is like a tablet, kind of like an iPad with like arms and legs and a persona.
Hmm.
There's Picture Phone, which is like a photo booth that allows Pee-wee to have video conference calls with other people. And then there's Globy, who's this like humanoid globe with a face and a voice, who does kind of geographic, like Google Mappy sort of stuff
Hmm.
for Pee-wee. And I think revisiting the Playhouse is important because it's this queer vision from the past of what a networked smart home might have become, like could have become, but didn't, and also like couldn't because it wasn't profitable
Yeah.
or rational. And also, Pee Wee is not treating these characters as his servants or as like objects. He's in mutual relationships of reciprocity and care with them. So they determine activities in the playhouse together. So it's a really different vision than what we have today of people yelling at Alexa or Siri or whatever the other ones are called to buy stuff or do stuff for them. It's this like other way of thinking about how we want to be in relationship with technologies that I think we can use to critique the present that we actually have, and imagine digital worlds otherwise.
What do you think the relation is between the Rube Goldberg machines that I think of as maybe more in the films, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe they appear in the TV show as well, and these more networked, maybe more digital characters from the TV show. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I seem to recall, at least with the first film, maybe even the opening sequence is Pee Wee waking up and getting breakfast made for him by a Rube Goldberg machine, which seemed to be so common in so many different films and shows of the 1980s. And I'm just wondering if there's some kind of statement or allegory going on across the networked characters from the show and the Rube Goldberg machines from the films.
Yeah, the Rube Goldberg machine is what opens Pee Wee's Big Adventure, which is the Tim Burton directed first Pee Wee film from 1985.
And that came out like a year before the show, right?
Yeah, it was before the show started. So he had like a Broadway show, like a live show, and then the film, and then he got the television contract. But it's like this absurd and extremely analog perpetual motion machine that makes Pee Wee's breakfast. So it juices oranges, it mixes pancake batter, flips pancakes, feeds his dog, all while Pee Wee is like sort of free to do other stuff while this machine's running. And the machine like doesn't work very well. It's like all these juices everywhere, many pancakes are stuck to the ceiling, but like that's not the point of the technology. Like the point is the kind of joy of it. It's like meant to do a task, but is also like wildly irrational because it would be easier for him to just do the task himself. And I think at the heart of your question, like what does a technology like this Rube Goldberg machine have to do with these computational characters in the playhouse is like he's not drawing a line between those things. Like there is at every stage in this character's life just this desire to be in relationship with gadgets and technologies and contraptions and animate objects that exist and function on terms that aren't about like fulfilling a task or aren't about efficiency.
Yeah.
It's like this kind of like joy and play.
Yeah. No, that's lovely. Yeah, that's very helpful. Maybe if you're down for it, I would love to think a little more about the second chapter, the porn house. Although I don't want to stop us if we have more to say about the playhouse because I think it's lovely writing and lovely work that you have there.
Yeah,
But
let's talk about the porn
let's
house. I would love
yeah,
to.
let's talk about the porn house. I'm so struck by is so much of the drama and the crisis and the conflict around the arrest probably hinges to some degree on the fact that Paul Rubens was often just conflated with his character and was so devoted to the character of Pee-wee that I think you wrote about this. He would make sure that no one ever, for instance, photographed him in character when not being filmed and while smoking a cigarette, right? Because he didn't want anyone to view Pee-wee as Paul Rubens. And precisely, I think what animates the sex panic here is that people do that. They do conflate Paul Rubens, the adult, the human, with Pee-wee Herman, the character. And I'm thinking too about the way in which a porn house is really a playhouse for adults, right? And the sense that porn as an object is one of the realms that adults have to experience play and pleasure, but we don't treat it the same way, obviously, that we treat play that a child would have. And so I'm really struck by the through line here of play, right? Paul Rubens is quite literally playing. He is having a good time. But this is a good time that is offensive to some, right? Or is impossible to square with the persona that he has developed for Pee-wee. And so, yeah, I'm not sure where we want to take this, but I'm really struck by the space of the porn theater as also being quite similar to the Playhouse as this isolated space that is not, it's, I don't know, I would question what we mean by public indecency, what constitutes the public within the space of the porn theater.
Yeah. So Rubens never appeared as Paul Rubens in public or in news media interviews during the time that the show was on, right? So if he did an interview like with Rolling Stone, whatever, he showed up to the interview as Pee-wee Herman and gave the interview as Pee-wee Herman. So the public did not understand Pee-wee Herman and Paul Rubens as separate people, even though, of course, they were. So when Rubens was arrested, and this was wild to me going back to like news archives and seeing this, but the press, like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, covered this story in ways that conflated Rubens with Pee-wee Herman. So, for example, there was a Associated Press wire story that was published in most papers of record in the United States and Canada, where the journalist interviewed child psychologists about how to talk to your children about Paul Rubens' arrest. But the article instructs parents to tell children like that Pee-wee had done something bad, that Pee-wee regrets doing this, that it was wrong. But people make mistakes, which is like wild to me that the advice to parents wasn't like, tell your kids that this is an adult man actor and that his sexuality exists, right? Like to tell kids about this in a developmentally appropriate way, but that like clearly makes it clear that there is like a television character who is this boy man child who they love, and then an actor who plays him, right? Like, how much is that going to mess up your kids if you're not like making that clear? So the like deep seated sort of homophobia of wanting to understand Rubens as Pee-wee Herman in order to mark him being in this porn theater as this like transgression instead of this like actually quite banal and boring thing. Like, yeah, he watches porn at a porn theater, like who cares, right? um it was like so deep seated. But yeah, like I mean, porn theaters are really interesting spaces in the sense that like any movie theater, you kind of disappear into them, right? They're like dark, the seats are soft, you can't see who's around you, it's this exit from the world outside. And it's summer right now while we're recording this, so you can imagine like going back out into the parking lot, and the air conditioning is this even climactic shock from inside to outside. It really marks this theater as this space apart and space away. I think about what it must have been like for someone like Rubens to have been living in public as this character for so many years, right? And how, exhausting that must have become at times. So his arrest in the summer of 1991, he had actually already decided to end the show about a year earlier because he was just burnt out and exhausted from playing the character. And he had like grown his hair out long because they were not going to be shooting again. And I think was just like kind of trying to live more as himself in this town where he grew up, that he was back visiting. To me, like that, the fact that Rubens was kind of experiencing this freedom from the character and then was arrested and shamed publicly for masturbating in the theater, like as the character, is one of the most tragic parts of how the story was framed.
Yeah, and I think it's important, as you're alluding, to note the changing understanding of the space of the porn theater. So hardcore porn had only been showing in theaters in a very public way since the early 1970s. So we're about 20 years into that, but the AIDS epidemic is already informing the way that people understand this space, which in the 70s, you would see celebrities in the magazines and in the news going to porn theaters. You would hear about like Jack Nicholson takes date to porn theater. And so it was quite well known that celebrities and famous people were going to these theaters. And it was not career ending for them. But by the early 1980s, porn theaters were being shuttered. They were seen as vectors for disease. Samuel Delaney has this delightful book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, where he writes all about the Disneyfication of Times Square, the closing of all the porn theaters, as well as this really interesting concept that he develops of contact and the way that porn theaters become a space for interclass primarily, but interrace contact of people who would not normally engage with one another. And he makes the argument that there's a kind of social good that comes out of bringing together people who would not normally exist in the same social spheres. So one of the things that I appreciate about your book is that you are helping to push against the grain of the more normative or standard argument about what the porn theater is, which is always, predetermined as deleterious and pathologizing. And here, I think you're right to call it just rather mundane. This is a rather mundane activity. I can think of far more explicit events that occur within porn theaters, and masturbating does not come even close to them. So it is helpful to remind ourselves at the same time that porn was moving into video at this point. So I think some people have written about, well, why wasn't he just, if you have to watch porn, why don't you just watch it at home? And I think that that's an interesting question, because it again brings up this concept of space that has kind of been hovering around this whole conversation, and this notion of what private space is and where sex can exist within space, even if it's self-serving sex, even if it's masturbation. What space is that allowed to be in? And I think it's important to note too, I'm going to forget the Supreme Court case, but at the time, any kind of same-sex sexual activity is going to be quite literally illegal within these spaces.
Yeah, it was Bowers versus Hardwick.
Yeah. So there's a lot historically to think about in this moment, but one of the things that the book helpfully reminds us is that the conversation that was being had with children, with people of our age, these elder millennials, was kind of quite messed up, quite conflating of the character with the person. Or in the case for me, was a non conversation. It was Pee-wee Herman and Pee-wee's Playhouse were in my life for 5 or so years, and then suddenly it was gone. And I never got an explanation of what Paul Rubens had done until my late teen years, and then it was, as the book notes, often quite erroneous in the way that it was presented. It was that spoken as though Pee-wee Herman had done this thing, and oftentimes presenting it as an affront to children, as though somehow his masturbation in a theater had been put to the end of trying to corrupt children, right? This notion that him masturbating in the theater was somehow related to, I guess, what we would today call the kind of groomer language, or the groomer panic.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what you think of, or what you found in your research with people recalling this event, and how it is bound up with those fears about about adults grooming young children.
Yeah, I mean, people were circulating rumors that he was caught masturbating in a regular Cineplex or at a Disney film. How I understood it as a kid was that he had done something sexually inappropriate with children. That was how people in my schoolyard understood it. My parents never explained it to me. These rumors circulated precisely as you pointed out as part of what we would today call groomer discourse, right? So this is about homophobia, and it's about AIDS phobia, and this what you talked about earlier in our conversation about queer people being sort of fundamentally associated with death and dying and the negative in the public imagination at this time, right? So this construction of perversion and all of that is to make an argument to parents that you ought to keep your kids away from gay people, which is a fear that is even more heightened when you have a kid like myself, or I would guess you, John, too, who's like at that age, like you can tell there's something queer about that kid. So it's like that. Those are the kids like you and I are the ones who I think are suffering the most from the sort of straightening impulses and the like cultural violence that comes out of this kind of story and the backlash that it engenders.
Well, I hope you are down for a conversation about dolls now, because the third and final chapter here is this delightful chapter about the Pee-wee dolls, which became collector's items. In part, I think we could argue because of the cancellation of the syndication, right? That all the toys were pulled off the shelves of Toys R Us and other toy stores. And before we fully jump into it, I do have an anecdote, which is that as a 6 or 7 year old, I was begging my parents for a Pee-wee doll for Christmas one year, and I got one. I got one not from my parents, but from my aunts and uncle.
Oh,
But here's an example of how bratty I was, which maybe it was informed by Pee-wee's sometimes brattiness. I did not get a speaking doll. I guess they were also producing non-speaking
yeah,
dolls in
yeah.
the mid to late 80s.
Because a lot of parents do not want a loud toy, electronic toy that talks at their house, which is very fair.
Very understandable, but I was so ungrateful. I like received this delightful gift from my relatives, and I just like immediately was like, "Where's the pull string? It doesn't talk. What why would you give me this?" So and I only remember that because my aunt told me that I was ungrateful, and I was so embarrassed as an adult to be like, "Oh my god, Aunt Lynn, I'm so sorry."
Mm.
But since then I have remedied this oversight on my relatives, and I've purchased one of the original dolls that should speak. But as your chapter astutely points out, almost none of the dolls today, whether they originally spoke or not, speak today, right? And that's because they have all, for the most part, broken. And you
Mm.
do this really amazing reading questioning that brokenness. And so I'm wondering what brought you, first of all, to want to acquire one of the dolls, because it's my understanding maybe we bought ours at approximately the same time, early
Yeah,
2020s.
yeah.
And then how you came to learn about like the history of their very brokenness.
So my partner Hazel has a non-talking Pee-wee doll that I've lived with along with her for 10 years or so. Um, and when I started writing this book, I wanted a talking one. So I ordered one on eBay around the same time as you, John. And I thought, I knew that they were all broken, but I hadn't kind of thought about what that means. And I thought I would buy the doll and maybe take it apart and repair it and write something about that process. And there's all these like people online who have fans who have tutorials about how to repair your broken talking Pee-wee doll. And the doll came, and I spent a lot of time with it and sort of researching the history of these dolls and how they were disappeared from toy store shelves, but also became really desired collector items amongst adults at the time that Paul Rubens was arrested. So people like really, adults really wanted these dolls and wanted to keep them and hold on to them. And they're all broken in the same way because, okay, the dolls have a tiny like phonograph or record player inside them made of plastic. And what makes a record spin at an even rotation when you play it is a device called a governor. It just like makes the speed consistent. So the governors in all of these talking Pee-wee dolls were basically like defective. They were built in such a way that they like untensioned and stopped working pretty quickly. So like everyone's Pee-wee doll is broken, and all the ads on eBay reselling these dolls are like, people have got grabbed them at estate sales or picked them from thrift stores or whatever and are reselling them to fans. They're like, the doll is broken, the voice sounds unintelligible, the doll screams, it's like his voice is a nightmare. All these descriptions of this broken, shrill, I think like quite actually queer voice. So they're all broken in the same way, but people hold on to them still. And I was interested in the book about like thinking about what it means to hold on to this like broken, worn out object and to keep it and to care for it. And the doll bearing these signs of like wear and of not being treated well, as a sort of analogy for what happened to Rubens as well, right? And the desire that queer fans have to like keep the doll and hold on to the broken doll as a way of sort of holding on to the memory of what happened to Rubens and what happened to Pee-wee in the wake of the sex scandal, when this show that was so important to so many people kind of disappeared from the public imagination.
It's really beautiful, the chapter and the way that you tie it together to the controversy around his arrest. My own doll, actually, also the paint is coming off on
Me
the
too.
top.
Yeah.
So he's actually a little bit bald, which for the listeners, you won't know this, but I'm a bald man. So
Oh, you match.
having a bald Pee-wee makes me love him even more. Like, oh, he's just like me. Um,
Where do you keep him normally, John?
in my office.
At
Yeah,
work?
on campus. I keep him in my office. He actually, you can't see it, but there's, I have a shelf above my desk and he just sits there watching me the whole time.
Yeah, that's where I keep mine too. He sits in my office, just looking down. It's a nice like object that students often ask about.
Yeah, very few of my students seem to know who Pee-wee Herman is, so I was actually struck by the fact that some of yours did, at least a little bit. I imagine maybe some of my older grad students might have some vague recollections to him, but
It's not that they necessarily like know who he is. They're just like, what's that weird doll?
yeah, what's that weird doll?
Yeah. And then I
Yeah,
get to explain it, which is a pleasure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are there things that we haven't touched on? I feel like this has been really informative and delightful to run through some of the highlights of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot, and it's been like a real pleasure to get to talk to you about the book and like to situate Pee-wee's Playhouse in queerness and our relationships to it, past and present, to get to do that with you.
I've enjoyed it so much. I do have a final question though.
Okay.
Where do you think like the scholarship on Pee-wee Herman goes from here? Because I think you've laid down a really amazing foundation to think about Pee-wee. And one of the things that the book did that I was so appreciative of was to point to the, somewhat limited amount of scholarship that has been done on him. I'm seeming to recall that there is some scholarship that occurred in the 1980s, but in the same way that Paul Rubens kind of went away or disappeared from the popular cultural memory, it seems like scholarship on him also kind of
It did.
disappeared for a while, which is why this book is so exciting to have out here in the world. Are there things that you wish like you could have turned your attention to, or unwritten topics that you think would follow up from this?
I mean, I would love to see like more people do work on Pee-wee's Playhouse and Pee-wee Herman. I think there's like a ton there, and I think it gets not taken up because of the silence that happens in response to the AIDS crisis. It's not just cultural, it happens in academia too, right? So I think this is a great text for folks to return to, but I hope that more than anything, what this book does is it gives other scholars, especially younger folks, like permission to sit with and think really seriously about things that they love that might seem silly
Yeah.
or not serious, and to take them really seriously, but to also, like, in their writing and their analysis, to save space for their own delightful and loving connections to those texts. Like, I would like this to open up, carve out more permission for people to get to do that, because I think that's what keeps queer media studies weird.
Absolutely. And we need it to stay weird.
Yes, even though uh, weird as a word is maybe being stolen by
Oh yeah.
the Democrats right now.
Yeah. It's a new insult, I guess.
No, but I'm gonna keep using it. So
I
whatever,
like it.
they can't have it.
They can do what they want with it, but I'm gonna keep it weird over here.
Yeah, me too.
Cait, thank you so much. This has been a delight.
Thank you, John. It was
Of
a
course.
pleasure.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book I Know You Are, But What Am I? On Pee-wee Herman by Cait McKinney is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.